Hello and welcome to the Singapore Sessions, a series about what Canada can learn from the Lion City. I'm your host, Emma Cochrane, and today we're talking scarcity and ingenuity. Singapore, as we've discussed, is small, and as such they have a lot of resource constraints, whether that's food, water, land to build on, natural resources, and energy. It has been an ongoing challenge. But it has also been the source of some really innovative solutions and creative approaches to resource management. And so, while Canada doesn't necessarily have the same resource scarcity exactly, we could all benefit from a little bit more ingenuity. So let's start with food. Singapore currently imports about 90% of its food from 170 regions, countries around the world. They're well diversified in terms of those trading relationships, but not at all self-sufficient. And so they've identified that this could be a problem and have set a target to have 30% of their food produced domestically by 2030. And so one space that we did a tour of was an aquaponics farm that's actually on the roof of a hotel. So they have fish tanks, the water from the fish tanks provides nutrients to grow the plants, and then both the fish and the plants are served in the hotel. And when we did the tour, they were talking about exploring the possibility of taking food waste from the hotel and turning that into fish feed so that it becomes completely circular. That's a bit harder because you can never guarantee what's going to be waste from the hotel, but the ambition for a completely circular system and the effort to get there is there. The government has also designated land for agricultural use, but one of the problems that our guide talked about was that they've assigned this land on 3-year leases. And from the farmer's perspective, there are some crops that might not be ready to harvest until year 5. They can't really invest in starting a farm on a 3-year lease. And I think that's an important reminder to take from this, that you have to build in mechanisms for feedback and adjustment over time into your policy. No matter how good the idea is, there's always going to be some little thing in implementation that you didn't consider that makes the policy not work. So I think on the one hand, we want to be inspired by this effort to bring more circularity to our food systems, and then also be reminded to include feedback loops in policy. Let's talk water. Singapore is a small island. Access to fresh water has always been an issue. And so a number of years ago, they built a facility called Marina Barrage that was designed to address this issue. And the big move was to build a dam across the mouth of the channel. And over the course of 2 years after the dam was built, there was a natural process of desalination where basically the salt water flowed out into the ocean, was replaced by rainwater, and over time it became a new 600-acre reservoir right in downtown Singapore. So that significantly increased the availability of fresh water. Marina Barrage also includes a pumping station to deal with floodwater. It has a capacity of about 280 cubic meters per second. So in times of heavy rainfall, when there's a risk of flooding, they turn on the pumps, they're able to mitigate that risk. And then in addition to that, the facility also includes a museum. You can learn about rainwater harvesting, about desalination, about water recycling programs, blue and green infrastructure, other sustainability initiatives. And it's also a public park and recreational space that's part of a 10-kilometer path all around the bay. And so I like this example for the big impact they were able to achieve on the availability of water, but also that kind of multi-solving approach where they're addressing water scarcity and flood risk, and they're building an educational and recreational asset for the city. So it's not just addressing the challenge, it's also looking for other opportunities. Land is also a major constraint for Singapore, and I think there's lots we could get into about efficient land use planning, but I want to focus on the way Singapore is actually looking beyond its geographic limits. So one of the newer projects that we discussed while we were there is the Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone. It's a development zone that's just across the border in Johor Bahru, and it really expands the availability of land that Singapore businesses have to invest in. And so we had some really interesting conversations there about what goes over there. How can Singapore benefit from this? We talked about the brand of Singapore. Singapore has established a pretty good reputation for quality, high standards, and whether or not that would carry over if, for example, manufacturing moved to this special economic zone in Malaysia. And we had an interesting debate about whether professional services firms, like architecture firms, if their practitioners had genuinely better technical design skills, or if the difference in price that a Singapore firm could command was just a perceived difference in quality, and what would happen if your headquarters moved across the border. And then we also had an interesting discussion about the idea of putting the dirty industries over there, some of the more heavy manufacturing, anything that's unpleasant for Singapore could stay across the border in Malaysia. And so there was a little bit of pushback around, is that fair? The way that it was explained to me and the perspective that I heard from the Singaporeans was that that kind of heavy manufacturing is a step in a natural process of economic development. That in the same way that Singapore started off with manufacturing and then a little bit more skilled manufacturing and then more kind of like service, white collar work to evolve into a global leader in finance, that there's nothing wrong with putting a factory somewhere because eventually that leads to more economic growth. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective that ties in with the idea of constant evolution and constant progress. One of the other perspectives on land that I thought was interesting, and it actually came out of one of the CSF publications, not out of our conversations in Singapore, it was this consideration of the way that digital technology has eroded the geographic borders between nations. And they mentioned a project in Estonia called the e-residency program, where you basically get a digital government ID, you can access digital services, you can sort of run an EU-based business without being a resident or a citizen. So Singapore is kind of exploring these ideas of what does it look like for a country to grow and expand its influence without physically expanding its borders. And I think that's really interesting at a moment where our neighbor to the south seems fixated on a sort of old school expansion through land acquisition approach, taking over Canada, taking over Greenland, etc. And meanwhile, countries around the world like Singapore are looking at how they might claim space in the new digital landscape. Energy is critical for Singapore because of the heat. Basically, without reliable access to electricity to power air conditioning, the city doesn't function in the same way. They don't have a wealth of natural gas or hydro to rely on. One of the things that we learned at the Cooling Singapore lab was that Singapore sometimes has 0 wind speed. They talked about how some of their software has been glitching out because it hadn't anticipated a 0 value for wind. So they've identified solar as the best bet for energy generation. And they have a target to quadruple their solar energy output. I actually saw one example of an array of solar panels that was on the water, which was new to me, but makes a lot of sense if you don't have land to put them on. And then at the same time, the Cooling Singapore Lab and other initiatives are exploring how to reduce the need for energy. So looking at other types of passive cooling possibilities so that they're not completely reliant on electricity. So what can Canada learn from this? We obviously have way more natural resources at our disposal than Singapore. We have way more land, even if we're just looking at the cities that we currently cluster in. We have abundant access to fresh water, we have power, we have space to grow food, and yet we have a housing crisis. And yet we have record numbers of people using food banks. We have energy, but we don't necessarily have the grid infrastructure to get it to everyone. Perhaps part of what holds us back is our size. We have, competing priorities depending where you live in the country. It takes a lot to build grid infrastructure over a huge amount of land. But I think also part of what holds us back is our access to resources. We haven't needed to think creatively yet. We haven't been so constrained that we have to be innovative. And so I think if we could look to Singapore and take some of that spirit of multi-solving, how can we do disaster risk management and also resource management at the same time, rather than waiting until we face a crisis that forces us to get creative, starting now to think about more creative solutions to reusing our resources.